So thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. I'm hoping that you'll find this very useful. I'm going to try and cover a fair bit of information fairly quickly, and I would ask that you keep any questions until the end, just so I can make sure I cover everything. So what I'd like to do today is give you a quick overview of the Regulation of Lobbying Act, who would be considered to be lobbying, what counts as lobbying, and then what to do if you are lobbying. So the Regulation of Lobbying Act is a new piece of legislation, came into force on the 1st of September last year, and it is a very broad-ranging piece of legislation. It allows for the registration of lobbyists, the regular submission of lobbying returns on an online register, and it's a web-based public registry that shows who is lobbying whom about what. There are investigation and enforcement provisions which are not yet enforced, but they will come into effect at the end of this year. And there is a provision for legislative review. Now, why does this matter to you? Well, communications which are considered to be lobbying have to meet a three-step test. They have to be made by somebody who falls within the scope of the Act, to somebody who's considered a designated public official, and it has to be what's considered a relevant matter. The Act includes zoning and development as a relevant matter. You don't have to be a business owner, you don't have to be a professional lobbyist, you don't have to be anybody other than just a regular, ordinary resident of Ireland to be captured by the zoning and development provisions of this legislation. Anybody who lobbies about zoning and development must register as a lobbyist and must submit returns of their activity. The Act doesn't make any distinction either about how formal or informal that activity is. So if you run into a designated public official on the street, in the shop, or in their office, it may well count as lobbying and would have to be registered regardless of where it takes place. It also doesn't matter if your lobbying is successful. If you've made the attempt to influence a person's decision making, then that is enough to meet the test. So, who is within scope? There are businesses that are captured, there are professional lobbyists, and also representative and advocacy groups. So what this means in terms of zoning and development, it means any resident would be considered to be lobbying if they're lobbying about zoning, but planners who are communicating on behalf of a client would also have to register as a third-party lobbyist. Advocacy groups, including, say, neighborhood groups, residents groups who are lobbying about zoning and development, may also fall within scope. Designated public officials include most elected and appointed officials at a senior level in Ireland. It includes members of local authorities, and it includes people within the local authorities in the executive group. So that's chief executives, directors of service, heads of finance, and here in Dublin it would also include the head of human resources. It's kind of about the pay grade, really, is how they make that determination. The relevant matters include the initiation or development or modification of any policy or any program. It also includes preparation of legislation, including bylaws, by the way, and the award of any public funds. It doesn't include implementation matters. Now, what this means in terms of lobbying about zoning and development is fairly specific. There are exemptions that would count for a person's principal private residence. So if it is the home that you primarily live in with no more than 1 acre of land attached to it, then that would be exempt if you were lobbying about a zoning change or a development plan for your own principal private residence. Anything that is purely factual information would also be exempt. So if you contact a local councillor and you say, I just need to know how the zoning process works. How do I apply for zoning? What is the permit process like? How long do I have to wait for a decision? That's all factual. If, however, you then stray into, listen, I could use your support on this zoning application that I've got going, well, then that's lobbying and that would have to be registered. So let's say you have met that test. You are somebody that falls within scope, you're lobbying about zoning and development, or you're lobbying about another relevant matter, and you have made that communication to a designated public official. You have to register. You register after the communication. You don't have to do it in advance, so that's easy. At least you don't have to worry about planning every communication that you might make. And what you would have to include is your name if you're lobbying as an individual, the name of your organization if you're lobbying on behalf of a business, and frankly, even if you are not lobbying on behalf of your business, you're supposed to include your business contact information. And it's because sometimes you just can't take off a hat. You know what I mean? If you're a business owner in a town and you're fairly prominent, you might have some access, you might have some influence other people don't have. They want to know on the register who it is that's lobbying and what their position is. If I were to just, write a letter to the Minister for Public Expenditure and sign it Sherry Perreault, well, I'm still the head of lobbying. If I'm telling him what I think about lobbying, it doesn't matter that it happened on a Friday evening or a Saturday during the day that I'm writing that letter. I can't take that hat off. So that's why you're supposed to include your business address and your contact information. You are, once you registered, obliged to submit a return 3 times a year. This is on prescribed dates, so if you're lobbying within the period of 1st of September to 31st of December, you have to submit the return within 21 days of the end of that period. So the dates are actually set out in the Act. You have to say who it was you were lobbying, what it was about, and what the type of communication was that you were using, as well as roughly the volume. You don't have to submit a return every time you pick up the phone. You just have to do one return for the period for every subject you're talking about. So if you're seeking a zoning change and you're lobbying a local councillor, maybe you talk to the chief executive in the local authority, you might make a couple of phone calls, you might have 1 or 2 meetings. Even if those meetings are informal, you just have to roll that up into a single return and submit that. If you're only lobbying one time in your life and you are going to never lobby again, then you can permanently cease lobbying after you've filed your return, and then you won't have future obligations to submit returns. But if you are going to be lobbying on an ongoing basis, then you have to keep in mind that those returns are due every 4 months, and that includes nil returns. If you're not lobbying in that period, you're still obliged to submit a nil return. And that's my presentation. I hope that this gives you at least a quick overview, and then we can have lots of time for questions. I would encourage all of you to look at the website that we have, which is lobbying.ie. We have guidelines for people who are undertaking lobbying activities, and we also have specific guidelines related to zoning and development. Because the Act is so broad in terms of how wide-ranging this particular piece of legislation is, this particular provision about zoning and development, I expect that a lot of people who would never consider themselves to be lobbyists are going to be caught within the scope of the Act. So it doesn't matter how you self-define, it doesn't matter whether you think you're a lobbyist, it's about the activity, it's about the communication. So if you are at any point in time either lobbying or going to lobby a designated public official about zoning and development, and you're not sure what your obligations are, I'd encourage you to visit the website, I'd encourage you to contact our office, and we'll try and guide you as best we can. So if you have any questions, I'd be very, very happy to take them.